Welcome to Presidential Policies. In this new series, we're going to kick off with President Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States. He was a successful actor and became one of the most successful politicians in history. Reagan had a vision of America as a beacon of light to the rest of the world, as a city on a hill that cannot be hid. And Reagan took action on this vision. I remember while Reagan was president, a local bank invited one of Reagan's admirals to come give a talk. And the thing that stands out about this talk 30-something years later was that the admiral was focusing on how to create stability in the Asia-Pacific area, to create stability so that the nations there could prosper. What could the Navy and the military in general do to help the world prosper? This was one of the main strategies in diminishing the influence and the spread of communism: stability and prosperity. When Reagan came into office, a majority of the nations in the world had authoritarian governments. When Reagan left office, for the first time in history, a majority of the nations in the world had democratically elected governments. And Reagan's vision and his action helped make this possible. Reagan's vision made him one of the most successful politicians in history. In his two elections, he averaged getting just over 94% of the Electoral College vote. There's only one president in history that had a higher average in the Electoral College, and that was George Washington. Washington won, Reagan number 2. That's an impressive record. Reagan's vision for America centered on taxes and reducing the role of government in America. Reagan's view on taxes was greatly influenced by tax policy during World War II. There were a couple of years in World War II where FDR had the top tax rate at 94%, and the top bracket was way down at $200,000. Reagan would make one movie a year, hit the top tax bracket, and take the rest of the year off. He didn't see any point in earning more money if 94% of it was going to go to the government in taxes. And he had a clear understanding of unproductive tax avoidance because he had been subject to that. When Reagan was running in 1980, the top marginal tax rate was 70%, and the top bracket was like $215,000. When the 70% tax rate started 15 years earlier, the bracket was $200,000, and adjusted for inflation, the current bracket was 59% lower than the bracket was in 1965. And if you adjust for multiples of GDP per person, the bracket was 67% lower in 1980. And this high marginal tax rate with a low and diminishing top bracket was eating into the incentive of our elite capitalists and those with the most talent among us to build businesses and grow the economy. It was adding to unproductive tax avoidance, which Reagan had a lot of experience with. And to have prosperity, one of the things you need to have is the first 5 to 10 brackets in an income tax schedule have to allow a large enough income with a low enough average tax rate that there's plenty of incentive to run businesses. And that was becoming an issue in the 70s. So Reagan's plan was a massive tax cut. And he got that massive tax cut passed into law in August of 1981. And in that basic formula of success, you have a goal, Reagan's vision for America. You have a plan, Reagan's tax cut. You take action on the plan, Reagan did that. And then you monitor the results of the action and make necessary adjustments. In the year after Reagan's big tax cut, the stock market dropped 20%. The budget deficit exploded. And economic growth was weak. It wasn't announced as official yet in that year, but a recession had started in August 1981, the month Reagan got his tax cut. And so Reagan was following that basic success formula. Reagan was making adjustments. He was pushing a substantial tax increase that would take back about a third to a half of his big tax cut through Congress. And there were different versions of his tax cut in the House and the Senate. And on Friday, August 13th, 1982, a conference committee between the House and Senate had a reconciliation legislation that cleared the conference committee that included Reagan's tax cut. And that day was the first day of the great bull market in stocks in the 1980s. The bear market low came August 12th. The beginning of the bull market came August 13th with Reagan's tax increase. And after a 5-month lag, a powerful, long-lasting recovery and expansion began. When the expansion finally ended in 1990, it was the second longest expansion in history, or as Republicans referred to it, as the longest peacetime expansion ever. Now, the combination of Reagan's tax cut and what was dialed back put the top marginal tax rate at 50%, and it remained at 50% from 1982 through 1986. Now, the top tax rate one year tends to affect growth a year or two later. The correlation with 2 years is actually a little bit stronger. So Reagan's 50% tax rate affected growth in 83 through 88, with the stronger influence on 84 through 88. The individual years of growth while Reagan was president. And you can see those last 5 or 6 years have strong growth. And here it is in the context of the last 100 years of growth. In 1984, the economy grew at 7.2%, and that was the fastest single year of growth since 1951. Reagan had a 5-year period that was the fastest 5-year period of growth since 1969. So it's easy to argue that Reagan's tax cut, his initial tax cut, was successful in spurring growth. It solved the problem of unproductive tax avoidance and insufficient incentive for business owners. Here's the growth in the context of the last 100 years. Reagan's 1984 had the strongest single year growth rate of any year since 1951. He had a 5-year growth rate that was the best 5-year rate since 1969. It's obvious that Reagan's tax cut spurred growth and increased the growth rate. In the context of the 100 years, Reagan had the 6th highest record for his 8 years of growth of the 17 presidents in the last 100 years. He was right behind Clinton and just ahead of Carter. Inspired by his success, in 1986 he was pushing tax reform. It was billed as revenue neutral, but it lowered the top marginal rate from the 50% to 28% in 2 steps in 1987 and 1988. And this tax reform did not have the success of his initial tax cut. If you look at the growth rate before tax reform and the growth rate after tax reform, the growth rate dropped 37%, coinciding with Reagan's tax reform. What the economists got wrong that were advising Reagan, and what most economists still get wrong, is they don't recognize that there is productive tax avoidance, where under the right conditions, a high marginal tax rate leads business owners to plow a larger share of revenue into growing their businesses where wealth can accumulate tax-free or at least tax-deferred. What happened with Reagan's tax reform and that lower marginal tax rate was that elite capitalists started pulling trillions more dollars of business revenue out of businesses as personal income. That left less money for workers, less money for research, less money to deploy the latest technology, less money for equipment, less money for growth. It pulled more money out to use for extravagant consumption, to pull in imports from abroad. In fact, it's not an accident that we haven't had a trade surplus since the top rate was 70%. Pulling the money out of businesses weakened the intrinsic growth of businesses, and money that was pulled out was then used in the financial markets to bid up the price of businesses. So we had asset bubbles forming. And we've had crashes. Since tax reform, we had a crash in 1987. We had a crash in 2000. We had a crash in 2009. And we had a crash in 2020. And there are still asset bubbles. And there are still crashes coming. Unfortunately, I don't know enough to tell you when they're coming. But there's a high probability that more crashes are coming. Prior to Reagan, the economy had tended to grow faster than the national debt. Here's the chart, and the black line shows the national debt as a percentage of GDP. And it hit a bottom in the third quarter of 1981, which was the end of President Carter's 4 fiscal years. Now, when a new president takes office, his first 9 months, the government is operating primarily under the budget or spending authority passed by the previous president. Reagan's 8 fiscal years ran from October of 1981 through September of 1989. And while Reagan had great growth every year under Reagan, the national debt grew faster than the economy. Reagan made a transition from fiscal responsibility, where expenditures by the government increased growth of the economy more than growth in the debt. Growing the debt isn't a serious problem if the economy is growing faster, if you're making the expenditures on infrastructure that helps the economy grow, or in the productive capacity of people that helps the economy grow. But that changed with Reagan, and we've launched towards this path of increasing fiscal irresponsibility. Reagan's vision is still powerful, and it's still possible if we can make the adjustments that restore prosperity and make America an example for the world. That's what this series is about. Next week, we're going to dig deeper into the marginal tax rates that Reagan had and how they influenced growth under Reagan, and how his changes influenced growth under his successors. We're going to look at the capital gains tax rate, and we're going to look at inflation and why the recession that happened under Reagan may not have been his fault. We're all in this together, and we can work together to fulfill Reagan's vision of America. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe below and like this video. That will help more people see it. Share this video. That will help more people see it. Let's work together to fulfill Reagan's vision.